going to be going over chapter 19, Human Evolution. So by the end of this chapter or this lecture, you should be able to explain how different skin colors evolved, describe how alleles can be harmful, beneficial, or neutral in their effect on survival and reproduction, and use skin color to explain human adaptation by natural selection. So this chapter and what we're going to focus on quite a bit is actually focused pretty heavily on the evolution of human skin color. And as you should already know, we're all pretty similar, right? So Homo sapiens, that's the biological species of humans. So Homo being the genus and then sapiens being our species. So we are the only species in Homo sapiens, although there are other species within the genus Homo, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So we are very highly similar to one another. So if you take a look at this graphic, if you've stacked up papers basically as tall as the Washington Monument, which if you've been there, you kind of have a little bit of a better idea, but it's about 555 feet tall. There's only about 200 pages in here, this little red highlighted version here, that accounts for all of the variation between humans of all races. So that means that only 0.1% of our DNA is different from one another. So there's not that much that makes us different from our neighbor next door, but we all do still have differences. Skin color is an inherited trait, but as you may know from looking at offspring from people that you know as well, they don't always match. And that's because there's lots of different genes that code for this trait. So kind of like eye color or height, there's not just one gene that contributes to skin color, there's many different ones. And skin tone overall reflects levels of melanin. So melanin is just a pigment that's produced by a type of skin cell, and you can kind of see this is like a outlet of skin basically, and you've got the follicle here, hair, we've got the epidermis, the top layer of skin, followed by the dermis, and then we get into the fatty tissue. And we have melanocytes that are embedded in this epidermis. So within the skin epidermis up here, we've got these little melanocytes that have melanin in them, and that is what controls or reflects your skin tone essentially. So looking at different skin tones across the world, it's a really good indicator of human evolution. And we'll get into this a little bit more throughout the lecture, but basically you can see that skin tone correlates well with geography. And you probably know this, and it sounds sort of stereotypical sometimes when you talk about it, but you think of, let's say, people in Norway. Do people in Norway have really fair or dark skin? Normally they're pretty fair, right? Versus if you go somewhere closer to the equator or if you're in Africa, then we're looking at darker skin. Okay, so it's all mostly relative to the position of the Earth's poles is how we've come to evolve these different skin tones throughout the world. So why did we evolve varying skin tones? What's the reason for it? Is there a biological reason to having lighter versus darker skin? And it turns out that there is. There's been some different hypotheses floated around throughout the years, but this is probably the most prevalent one, is that it's related to folate or folic acid and vitamin D production. So we know that folate, which is basically vitamin B, those levels are really influenced by UV light. So the lighter skin you have, the more easily that folate is destroyed, and you don't actually get the amount of folic acid that your body needs. So we know too that melanin, so again, darker pigments basically, we all have melanin, but the more melanin you have, the darker skin tone you have. Melanin is really good at absorbing UV light. So you can have more melanin or darker skin tone in a higher UV light environment. So again, in order to get vitamin D, we have to have UV light. So vitamin D production requires this. So when we're looking at, let's say, a low UV environment, so here we're talking about North or South Pole, and not just the pole, but a little bit further down, getting towards maybe Tropic of Cancer. And then over here, we're talking about closer to the equator, right? So our low UV light environment favors the light skin because we have low UV, so it means that it's not going to destroy that folate, And it's enough that we're getting some vitamin D production in the individuals that have light skin, whereas the darker skinned individuals their skin won't be able, or the UV, won't be able to penetrate how dark their skin tone is. So they're not going to get as much vitamin D production from UV light as they would need. Versus over here, when we're getting closer to the equator, we've got a higher UV environment, and now we're favoring the darker skinned individuals because they're going to protect against that folate production. So they're going to be able to handle it a little bit better, and they're going to get enough UV that's able to penetrate their darker skin so they get enough vitamin D protection as well. Versus our lighter skinned individuals closer to the equator, they're going to have all of their folate destroyed, and they will still be getting vitamin D, but possibly at a much greater cost. Okay, so again, you've got the sun, you've got UVB rays, and there's all sorts of UV rays really that we're getting, but we're talking more specifically about UVB rays right here because it's more specifically tuned into folic acid and vitamin D. So again, people with the light skin are more vulnerable to folate destruction, whereas dark skin, they will be getting insufficient vitamin D production if they're in a very low UV light environment. So we've got to have just the right UV light with those skin tones in different parts of the world. So that's why we see this human evolution that's sort of developed geographically over time. Okay. So a few things about folate as well as vitamin D here in a second, why they're important. But folate, you can get them from other places, right? So vitamin B and vitamin D you can get from other sources, but a big source is UV light that's coming from the sun. They are found for vitamin B or folate. They're found in beans, dark green leafy vegetables, whole grains, poultry, pork, shellfish, liver. And it's really critical during periods of rapid cell division. So this is actually super essential for DNA synthesis. And if you're thinking about when DNA is being synthesized, when we're going through really high bouts of DNA cell division and replication, is probably like close to birth, right? Or when you're making a new baby, anything like that. And it comes at different times, obviously, but folate deficiency as a child or in the womb can be a really bad thing. Can also lead to low sperm count, spina bifida, which is where your spinal column doesn't close all the way around the spinal cord before birth. So this is why moms are supposed to be taking lots of folate or vitamin B while they're pregnant as well. Can also lead to anencephaly, which is always fatal. So on the other hand, vitamin D, again, you can find vitamin D in lots of things that sort of have a lot of calcium we think of as well. So fortified milk, fish, cheese, butter, cereals, and it permits the absorption of calcium and phosphate in the small intestine. So it is really important. It also enhances bone mineralization. So it's sort of similar. You kind of hear it hand in hand a lot of times with calcium. But the UV light stimulates the skin to produce vitamin D. And again, we want to make sure that we have enough vitamin D, especially if you're a pregnant woman. If you have vitamin D deficiency, it can lead to preeclampsia, which is elevated blood pressure, or it can also reduce your bone density in the pelvis, which is not something you want happening when you're trying to birth a baby. Also, some risks for children. It can lead to premature birth. It could also lead to rickets disease or multiple sclerosis. Okay, so again, why did we evolve these varying skin tones? So researchers kind of asked this, and they were wondering if there was actually a hypothesis for it, if this was all sort of just a coincidence. So they started looking at where you see these different skin tones and what might be the possible reason for where you see them. And they noticed that when you compare the skin color with the levels of UV light, the weaker the UV light, the fairer the skin. So you can see weaker UV up here and down here, whereas right here, kind of in the tropics and near the equator, we've got really high UV. Okay, and that's where we're seeing our darker skinned individuals. Just showing you UV index, so you can kind of look down here at more of the, neutral colors, the gray and brown, red that you're seeing kind of close to this equator area right in the middle. And then as you get towards the poles, we're getting into this nice purple color that's showing you very, very low UV index. So we know that light skin is helping the body produce vitamin D in sun-poor parts of the world, and dark skin is helping protect the body's folate stores in really sunny climates, so again, towards the equator. So that's part of the geographical reasoning for why we see light-skinned versus dark-skinned people in different parts of the world. Again, we are so advanced in our society and through our diet and all sorts of different things that we really have the ability to be able to live in different places, right? I have fairly fair skin and I'm living arguably in the tropics, right, where normally darker skinned individuals would do better here. And then you also have darker skinned individuals that might be in places like Canada or Norway. And it doesn't mean that they're not going to be able to survive or be able to reproduce, or even that they wouldn't be able to attract mates easier necessarily in those places. It just means that evolutionarily they were developed in these different places because of the advantages of the UV light in, either too much UV or too little UV in different places. So it's what kind of led to this skin tone difference. Doesn't mean that you couldn't do well there now. We have so many advances now that this isn't as much of a factor, but it's still something that you see geographically. Okay, so switching gears just a little bit, you guys have heard of 23andMe, I know, or Ancestry DNA, and you get to basically send in a little cheek swab sample and find out what your DNA says about you and your family. I personally haven't done it. My brother has done it, so I stole his, but we do have different DNA, so it would technically look a little bit different for both of us, especially a little bit different between males and females. But what are they actually looking at when they're looking at your DNA? So, in order to perform the genetic analysis that confirms your common ancestry, they're actually looking at something called mitochondrial DNA. It's commonly abbreviated mtDNA. And mitochondrial DNA is only inherited from your mom. So remember when we talked about your gametes? So women have eggs, men have sperm. Eggs are much, much larger, right? Which means that they carry a lot more stuff with them. Including organelles. So in our eggs, we have things like mitochondria, whereas sperm do not have that. Okay, so the only thing that you can inherit mitochondrial DNA from, or the only person that you can inherit it from, is mom. So mom is passing on her mitochondrial DNA, and just like how a dad passes on a Y gene to their sons and it's relatively unchanged, the same thing happens with mitochondrial DNA being passed from mom. So your mitochondrial DNA is relatively unchanged, pretty much the exact same as your mom. And it's only inherited from your mom. It did not come from your father. Okay. So because we know that this mitochondrial DNA mutates at a regular rate, we can kind of figure out exactly how long since groups diverged based on the number of differences. So this is a pretty common theme when we're looking at genetics, right? The more differences you have in your DNA sequence, the more diverged you are, the further related you are. The closer related, you have less and less differences. So any mom that has a mutation in her mitochondrial DNA is going to pass it on to all of her children. That is pretty much 100%. That doesn't really change. So because of that, you can really track the human ancestry and build what's known as an evolutionary tree, which you guys have kind of been getting familiar with. This is very similar to a phylogenetic tree, but it's starting to look a little bit more family-like. And we can trace it back all the way to what we call mitochondrial Eve. So mitochondrial Eve is basically like kind of the first female, and what every living person has come from. Now, the way that they're talking about mitochondrial Eve doesn't mean to say that there weren't other females living at the time. There were, and there's fossil evidence to show that, I think, but it means that over time these individuals didn't succeed, or they weren't able to reproduce, and they basically, or their offspring died off. So essentially all living humans at this point have come from one lady or one female, and that is our mitochondrial Eve, and that's how they've traced back this DNA. And looking through this mitochondrial Eve, or mitochondrial DNA, to find mitochondrial Eve kind of also gave a little bit of evidence to the hypothesis of where humans actually evolved from and where we came from. And there's two different hypotheses. The one that we'll focus on and the one that's pretty widely accepted is called the out of Africa hypothesis. So this is just the idea that humans originated in Africa, and then you had a group migrate to other continents, and then eventually just started migrating all over the world. And this started happening about, well, our modern day humans, Homo sapiens, started evolving about 200 to maybe 150,000 years ago. And there are additional fossil evidence that shows that modern humans lived in Africa at the time of this mitochondrial Eve. So the oldest fossils they found in Ethiopia are about 160 and 195,000 years ago, which is right at the time that they placed mitochondrial Eve. So it's pretty interesting. We find Eve here in somewhere close to Ethiopia. I know I just circled the whole continent. But that's where we're going out of Africa, right? And then about 40,000 years ago, we start going into more like Europe and the Middle East. 67,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, 13,000, 60,000. And a lot of this, right, depends on sort of the tectonic plate movement and how our continents have drifted, as well as how different societies have been able to move across, right? When we talk about Polynesians, how they eventually got to Hawaii, how they got to different parts of Polynesia. So it kind of depends on one, tectonic plate movement, but two, on getting into like tool use and stuff like that in order to actually migrate into these different geographical regions. But this is the out of Africa hypothesis, and it's basically that all of us came from Africa from this mitochondrial Eve and have evolved over time to be in different places. So becoming human, any member of the biological family Hominidae, so that's like in the, we go through the domain, phylum, you get all the way down to family. We're in the family Hominidae. And again, our genus is Homo, our species is Sapiens, and our family, Hominidae, includes living and extinct great apes. So it includes us, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos. So all the great apes we are pretty closely related to. Our most closely related, obviously, is the chimpanzees, which you probably hear, and we're like 99% related to them, which is pretty crazy. Although it's been quite some time, I think it's been about 7 million years since our latest common ancestor. And this is one of the fossils that provided some pretty big clues. Artie is what they named her, about our earliest human ancestor. So she was about 4 feet tall, weighed about 110 pounds, and likely lived in a really forested environment. So this is kind of when you start to see the members of this family starting to walk upright. And you can see that she's kind of transitional. She's got really long arms here, so she might have been able to climb trees really well. She might have been able to not only walk upright, but walk on all fours. So she's kind of in a transition there. And her teeth, adapted to a lot of different kinds of foods, has smaller canines than chimps. Skull, the brain is the size of a chimp's. Again, spine is a little bit longer and curved to actually support walking on two legs. Arms and legs are actually equal length here. So it's kind of getting into like where you would actually be walking upright. But again, most people's arms are not quite as long as their legs, so you can see how kind of weird her arm looks here, how large it is. You can see kind of a timeline here. So we start from 7 million years ago and move all the way up to our modern day Homo sapiens and how we're working our way through this Hominidae family. So again, humans and chimps are most closely related. Our last common ancestor was about 7 million years ago, although they don't have any fossil evidence yet. So you do hear about fossil evidence in the news every now and then, different species that they might discover, different transitionals. If we hear about this one's going to be pretty big. So keep an eye out for that. I don't think that they necessarily have any leads on it, but it's interesting how much we still don't know and how much we do know from inferring different things from the fossil record that we have completed. Okay, but Homo sapiens, so modern day humans, we are characterized by the ability to walk upright as well as a big brain. So we've got a much bigger brain than most other members of the family. So we start back about 4.4 billion, or sorry, not billion, million years ago with Ardipithecus ramidus. They had a pretty small brain. They do have the bones that show they could walk upright, but they would also go on all fours in trees. So that's Artie, right? That's the one we were just talking about. About 2.6 million years ago, so we're working our way up, we're getting to Australopithecus. They could also walk upright. They seem to live on the ground. Their arms were probably a little bit shorter, starting to get a little bit shorter than their legs, and we had evidence that they actually started to use tools. So brain probably got a little bit bigger as well, but still not quite where we are today. Homo erectus, that was about 800,000 years ago. These are the guys that started to control fire. And then we get to Homo sapiens, which we evolved somewhere between 800 to 200,000 years ago, and now we've got a much bigger brain, which allows us to have much better communication as well as problem solving. And that's probably the reason overall that we have not or did not go extinct, whereas all other members of this genus Homo have gone extinct over time. And it's likely due that they have a smaller brain, so they couldn't quite develop the communication and problem solving skills that modern day humans could. So going back to skin color, how we actually select for this, obviously environmental factors are playing a role, right? So we know that lower or higher UV kind of favors different traits as well as skin color. So it can act on traits or phenotypes which will increase or decrease the allele frequency in that population. So if we're in somewhere up high towards the poles where we have lower UV, we're favoring any sort of traits or genes that would lend to a lighter skin tone. So you're going to start seeing an increase in those genes in the allele frequency of a population. Okay, so there's a few different ideas for how we could have actually had this skin color change, because looking at the evidence and what we have, it's likely that when we evolved and we came out of Africa, we all started with darker skin. So that could have happened a few different ways. One is it could have happened through mutations, which introduced new alleles into the population. And then once that mutation happened, it just got selected for via natural selection, whether it was something that allowed us to adapt better or worse. Right? So if you had a darker and a lighter skinned person in Norway, the lighter skinned person would probably do better, be more successful at reproduction, et cetera, pass on more of their genes and increase that allele frequency, whereas the darker skinned person would probably not do as well. They wouldn't necessarily go extinct or not be there anymore, but they would have less of them, so they would decrease that allele frequency. And again, these different environments just select for different traits and therefore different alleles. Okay, so you can see that we can either have the mutation, which introduces a new allele into the population, and depending on the environment, it may or may not undergo selection. So it might not really go through anything, right? Neutral, where it doesn't really change in the next generation, it doesn't really benefit or hurt you. But it could also have a positive selection where now we've got greater reproductive success, so you start seeing more of that allele. Or it could have negative selection where it doesn't have very good reproductive success, so we start to decrease that allele frequency. So as far as moving out of Africa, again, the high UV light environment, individuals with dark skin reproduce more successfully. So you can see that pretty much everywhere down here, and then once you start getting into the tips, we're getting into lighter skin again. But migrating into the lower UV environments, again, the light skinned individuals were reproducing more successfully, and it's because their folate's not destroyed and they have enough vitamin D to keep them happy in those environments. Okay. So you can see the different ways that they're moving about just depending on essentially the time period and how well they're doing in different geographical regions. More evidence of human evolution. So it's a lot of times we hear different stereotypes, and sometimes they're associated with behavior, sometimes they're associated with genes, but they're not necessarily a stereotype. They actually come from science in some cases. So looking at evidence of human evolution, for instance, African ancestry, a lot of Africans have an allele that help resist malaria. Obviously, this is really helpful because this is a disease that they have there that's pretty common, whereas, say, in the US, we don't really have malaria or quite as big of a problem with it, so we don't have alleles that would help resist that because we don't need it. So it's not really selected for in this environment like it would be in Africa. Northern Europeans, this one might not be as obvious necessarily, but they have an allele that helps them digest milk better, so they can really take on lots and lots of lactose or milk. Tibetans, they have an allele that helps red blood cells compensate for low oxygen levels in their high altitude environment. I always think of these guys, if you know anything about like high altitude climbing, we've got the Himalayas that border Tibet, and lots of other countries right over there. And this applies to more than just Tibetans, right? Or we're talking about maybe Sherpas. If you've ever heard of them or seen people climbing Everest, the reason that some of these guys can climb Everest really easily or somewhat seemingly easily, or they've been able to do it loads of times and they can carry up everyone else's stuff, they don't have to acclimate quite as much, is because they've got their red blood cells essentially are acclimated to that environment already, and they're able to compensate for lower oxygen levels. So I don't know necessarily that they have more red blood cells, although they probably do, but this allele that they specifically have allows them to live in that environment really successfully.